guess we can start. People will trickle in as and when they fancy takes. Good evening. I'm Deepak Thapa from Social Science Baha. My pleasure to welcome you to our 103rd in the lecture series. Privileged to have Mallika, someone we've known for a while now. But first, can I ask you to please switch off your mobile phones, put them in some sort of quiet mode. We have Mallika with a very intriguing title, as it must have all piqued your own curiosities. Afterlife as ground zero of an industrial beginning, death of the garment industry in Nepal. Mallika is well known in Nepal, and pretty much so since last year, and the publication of her book and the somewhat extensive publicity she received in the media. I have to admit that I have bought the book, but have not had the time to read it, but I hopefully will sometime soon. But from people who have read it, they have all very good things to say about the book. And I hope those of you who have not yet gone through it will be inspired after this talk to read it too. You can move to the front. Shekhar, come on, move to the front. A lot of space here. So the lecture will be talking about, you've seen the abstract, so we'll be dealing with a certain aspect of contemporary Nepali political and social and economic life, which I'll just pick up a couple of sentences from the abstract that really struck me. When she talks about the rupture that disembedded life from work has gone undiscussed in Nepal, not only among policy wonks and bureaucrats, but also policy, the public commentators and academic researchers. And she talks about how the policy myopia and amnesia, both of them, addressing both of which might help building a different kind of future. So with that, I'd just like to introduce Mallika. She is a senior assistant professor at the Department of Sociology at South Asian University, and recently been appointed the coordinator of the department. For those of us of a nationalist kind, something to be proud of. She works on the social embedding of industrialization and development, and she's the author of this book, which has been well received, as I mentioned, Death of an Industry, the cultural politics of garment manufacturing during the Mars Revolution in Nepal. Before she became an academic, she worked for the World Bank and UNICEF for a number of years. She worked in Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe. And of course, she has another side to her, that she's a poet too. And she does comment now and then on literature. So, multifaceted personality with feet in the development world and now firmly in academia. And I think very well placed to discuss what we want to hear. Thank you, Mallika.
Thank you for the generous introduction. I'm usually very scared of my comments, and it never works, but this is working fine. Okay, it's a pleasure to have a rich platform like this, so thank you so much, Deepak, for inviting me to deliver this talk. I'm visiting Nepal, and for those of us who live in India and do meet visitors who come from Nepal, I think it really is a privilege to come to Nepal and be reminded of the field. It's something that we work on. I mean, usually the existence of working on Nepal outside Nepal is, we live in a strange kind of surreal situation, and suddenly when you come here, I think it kind of strikes in many ways. And I have really fond memories of like last year's semester break, which is what brings me to Kathmandu every year for a longer period of time, and launching the book, a very, very warm response that I've received from so many people, from so many different walks of life. And my intention in writing that book was to, in fact, we discussed about who do we write that book for and how should it be read, and I said I would like this to be accessible to everyone in Nepal, regardless of this narrow domain of anthropologists and scholars. And my publisher told me then we have to rewrite the book we have to think in terms of pricing, because it can't be unaffordable to most non-academic public private persons. But also it has to be accessible. So quite a lot of, the pure academic kind of thinking, which is the kind of basis of reasoning for many academics, have to be processed, and what actually went into the final writing is an outcome of the thinking process, but written in a slightly different way. So I've used a term called industrial ecosystem, and I've tried to explain it in the book in, I think, a lot more accessible way. And what I wanted to do here today is maybe to think a bit more on the abstractness of that concept. What do we mean by ecosystem, and what do we mean by industrial ecosystem, and how do we kind of juxtapose it against a very particular, concrete, specific industrial policy debate that happens every now and then, right? So that's the thought behind it, and let's see how it works. I have written a few pages, and if I'm going too long, then just let me know and I'll stop. I could borrow a pen. I have this compulsive disorder. If I don't have a pen, I'll see. Okay, so afterlife as ground zero of an industrial beginning, death of the garment industry in Nepal. How do we experience and theorize rupture? The discourse on ruptures involving blood and life and death has often been framed under the framework of violence, while the framework of exploitation has regularly been used to discuss issues about toil. So death, blood and toil kind of discussion. And these are discussed along the lines of exploitation, along the lines of labor. So borrowing from both labor studies and studies of violence, and building on many other discourses that I encountered on the way, I wanted to begin my talk with a soliloquy at this stage on whether the word death in the title of my book can be replaced with another word, afterlife. And immediately we are reminded of a possible substitutive rival, rebirth, or punarjanma, and I see some merit in it. But I wanted to clarify that the idea of afterlife for me is slightly different from rebirth, essentially in its collective spirit. And by collective, I of course mean collective among the humans involved, men and women, owners and workers, but also I wanted to focus that by collective I also mean the broader ecosystem of surrounding landscapes and lifescapes that are not always human. So unlike rebirth, my concept of afterlife lets go of the singularity of one individual life seen in isolation from others around him and her. Instead, this concept of afterlife views life as a collective of human and the surrounding nature. And more importantly though, it maintains the spatial specificity of life here in this place as we call Nepal now, as opposed to some cosmic idea of life in the universe. I'm aware of the pitfalls of falling prey to methodological nationalism or any other forms of narrow nationalism in that sense, but I do feel that the anchor in my notion of afterlife is the place and the web of politics that upholds it, rather than the cosmology of souls inhabiting the void. Death in the book is never fully disconnected from life of the author, as in very, very practical terms. And here my full disclosure is that I wrote that book mostly contemplating and carrying out motherhood. And the afterlife process that I'm beginning to immerse myself in also has a lot to do with raising a 5-year-old, basically. And there's a very practical implication why I'm bringing it up, because what I wanted to talk a little bit about is a kind of a story through which I felt I could enter the topic that I wanted to discuss in. And that comes from watching this Japanese anime, which I watched with my daughters over and over and again for months and months and months. So, and I allowed myself, an old brain teacher, to stoop to that level of childhood joy, because I felt some of the Hayao Miyazaki's movies are probably better theories of human life than those scattered in my anthropology and sociology textbooks. And for example, if those of you who might be fond of Miyazaki anime, there's Marnie, who is a seinen ghost, blurring the lines of life and afterlife, and also sexualities, and of course the lines between childhood and adulthood. And then there is the world of Arieti, these really small people who live among us in our kitchens, like insects do, but they are full humans, and who forces us to think about our inhabiting places, our homes and offices, and how we carve these out for ourselves by essentially colonizing the lifescapes and landscapes around us. But the one that I wanted to discuss here more specifically is Princess Mononoke. whose synopsis I'd share a little bit in discussing the notion of this collective ecosystem of life, as opposed to a singular or species-centric lives and afterlives, which I hope that will allow me to enter my topics. So, I feel very uncomfortable. This is working. So at one level, the story of Princess Mononoke is about the death of a factory. It is set in the late Muromachi period of 14th to 16th century, known for Japan's trade and industrial engagement with China, but also just before the Portuguese landed in Kyushu and followed by the Spanish and the Dutch in the 17th century, thereby ending Japan's isolation from the West. The movie begins with a wounded boar, charging itself aggressively towards a little hamlet. The boar, Nago, has been possessed by demons so much so that the worm-like flames wriggling all over his body give it a super animal strength which can destroy everything and anyone that comes on his way. A young prince, Ashikata, riding on his yoke, Yakul, kills Nago, but his demonic corruption curses his right arm. Looking at the wound, the village oracle tells him that the wound will gradually suck his life and will kill him eventually, unless he gets the great forest spirit, who is a deer-like animal, also called the night walker or Daidarabochi from the Shinto mythology, to bless and cure him. So Ashikata heads west, to distant west, into the land of San or Mononoke, meaning vengeful spirit Oryo, who is a human girl adopted by Moro, the wolf goddess. The tribe of Moro is caught in conflict with Lady Iboshi, who rules a small settlement built around the economy of an iron smelter. Ashikata follows Mononoke and her old tribe, hoping that they may help him locate the dear god who would cure him from the curse. Mononoke refuses to speak with Ashikata, but on the way back he sees the wounded worker, and while helping him, Ashikata encounters Kodama. These are the little spirits who show them the way through the jungle. And also that he catches a glimpse of the famous dear god, who momentarily gazes at him kindly and then he vanishes. So Lady Iboshi has set up her industry town by clear-cutting forests and thereby provoking a war with all the animal tribes who consider the forest as theirs. So these include the tribe of the wolves of the Moro, who raised the human girl San or Mononoke, abandoned by her fleeing parents, the tribe of the boars under their blind leader Okoto, the tribe of the apes who want to eat wounded Prince Ashikata to gain human strength and smartness and be able to outbeat him in battle, the mice, the Kodama spirits who live in the trees keeping the forest healthy, and many more. So on the sides of the humans, there is the hierarchy. And within this hierarchy, Lady Iboshi is a quintessential Lady Macbeth, basically, ruthless and ambitious, but in this case also benevolent to the downtrodden, and rebellious against the powerful. Lady Iboshi's iron town, buzzing with industrial chimneys and elaborate structures of job division, evokes the quintessential industrial revolution of the British Victorian era. But unlike the heartland of capitalism, this remote iron town is also a refuge for the social and physical outcasts, including prostitutes who live as equal among the workers and lepers, well looked after in the sanatoria. As the protector of these downtrodden beings, Lady Iboshi fights the samurais and builds strategies for defense, and eventually what she does is she agrees to a deal with the emperor that she would offer him the dear god's head, and in return for his political protection for her iron industry. With this, an all-out war breaks out between the humans and animals, and caught in between are the two human mediators dwelling in the jungle, Mononoke and Ashikata. Former is adopted in infancy by the wolf queen Moro, and latter loved by his elk Yakul, and now blessed by the dear god himself. Each of the two take turns to be trapped into and attacked by Lady Iboshi, but then also be saved by the other. And as the battle rages further, the boar king Okoto is tricked into leading humans to the dear god who had come to bless Ashikata. So Iboshi cuts his head, the head of the dear god, with her bullet. And they assume that the headless dear god will now die a human death. Their imagination of death cannot surpass human logic. But dear god is a god of both life and death. And as Moro had earlier reminded Okoto while explaining why the dear god let Boar Nago die and saved human Ashikata, life and death are the dear gods to take and give. So unlike the human imagination of a carcass, headless dear god metamorphoses into an amoeba-like eukaryotic, multiplying itself million-fold so fast that the toxic liquid oozing from its body soon connects everything and everyone into one ecosystem of nature, and in doing so, turns its body into the landscape itself. This catastrophic frenzy is a scene of Sanhara. So first to go is Lady Eboshi's right arm, with which she had pressed the trigger in the gun that split dear God's head from body. Second are her troops, who gave her the industrial and governmental status. Third, the smelter itself and the iron town. Fourth, everything in the landscape, the surrounding vegetation and the animal kingdom. And eventually it becomes clear that the only way to stop this mayhem is to return dear God's head. And that can only be done with human hands. So Mononoke and Asikata perform this last rite, after which another marine catastrophe breaks in the last hour of the night, as the Daidarabochi or the night walker or the deer god takes its head back, returns to its normal shape, and digs into the little pond. The temporal logic is lost in the moment of afterlife, and when the dawn breaks out, Asikata finds himself just lying next to Mononoke with all the new lives of vegetation flourishing around him. Their bodily and emotional wounds have been completely healed, the curses have been lifted. The only sign of the bygone epoch is some tattered flag somewhere demarcating where the iron smelter once might have been. So the story is about the death of a small and isolated human civilization revolving around an iron industry, but a death of this nature can never be about an industry or an individual. It has to be about a broader collective, which I have called an ecosystem in my book. This much has been clear to me from the time when I felt there's a book in me, and not so much the PhD thesis, because that's more technical, but I think I wanted the book to be more accessible to everybody who don't want to pursue the PhD or the master's. But what is frustrating and still is the situation that we are made to tell ourselves, both as researchers and thinkers, but also as practitioners and activists, that there is no method allowing us to problematize an industrial death in its entirety. We hear the story of the death of an industry in terms of the thickness of the stack of cash passed on to the strangers, and the strangers could be strangers in terms of kin, class, nation, and race. Numbers of working hands made redundant, but never quite their broader being. Number of man-made buildings unleased and not unleashed. Number of commodities left unproduced or unassembled in terms of measurement of growth, etc., etc. But never death as the end of the life as we know it, or the re-emergence of an afterlife. More often than necessary, at least, as I've been told, that those who need to make a difference in real life need to get over sentimentality and crunch data and come up with precise policies that can be formulated and implemented. At times, these approaches have been engendered, pedestrianized, and associated with their supposed anecdotedness. There's a long history of similar debates about rational take on economic aspects of life, dismissing holistic and non-rational accounts, as has been referred to as formalism versus substantivism debate by economic anthropologists. I want to touch upon a more recent of the formalism versus substantivism debate before I segue back into my discussion of the industrial life and death. This debate largely concerns what we popularly understand by expressions such as money, asset, property, resource, wealth, and so on and so forth. And are these all the same? And if not, why are they lumped together when we differentiate a group of people from one to another on the basis of class? In very simple terms, the haves and have-nots. Everyone is familiar with Pierre Bourdieu's theory on distinction, where he brought the notion that one person may have less money and physical assets, but still may have bigger power and higher status in society that would allow him to take bigger risks by giving him means to hedge his risks, and thus giving him the chance to earn larger profit in the long run. He then attributed these possibilities to that person's inherited social status, which helps form a habitus through a larger pool of friends and relatives who would help him in a way that generated material value at some point in time. It is important to note that Bourdieu never considered habitus strictly rational, nor was he suggesting that this larger pool of friends and relatives who may be eventually useful to the person concerned is the same as a shrewd businessman's calculated building of business networks. The social capital, as Bourdieu explains, is largely social but may occasionally be investable and harvestable in material terms, but not always. This notion about the social capital or cultural capital, as Bourdieu put it, is not about rational strategization concerning the health of a certain industry or commodity. It would have to be about the holistic trajectory of a society. In other words, his is clearly a theory about social reproduction of class, than a theory about business or developmental competitiveness. Bodhi's notion of social and cultural capital has been interpreted in various ways, but Bodhi is not only scholar who has responded on social capital. Although several others from different schools of thought, including sociologist James Coleman from the School of Rational Choice, has discussed this. It is Robert Putnam that I wanted to mention here, who popularized the notion of social capital about 2 decades ago by tapping into the nostalgia about loss of community. Putnam's argument that trust-based networks can improve the efficiency of social functions by facilitating a cooperative spirit that can trigger economic and developmental success, even in the face of adversarial rule, offered economists a new explanatory variable, readily usable in topics relating to social, cultural, and political studies. He drew liberally from his views on Italian Renaissance and contemporary development to infer that the North in Italy had developed because it had good kind of social capital, proper Christian neighborhood associations, as well as secular but spiritually Italian institutions, whereas the South had sunk because it lacked social capital, and mafia and corruption grew in this vacuum of social capital. From there, Putnam makes a continental jump and claims that harmonious and progressive neighborhoods in the contemporary North America now afford it to be so not because of the entrenched race and class politics, but because of their virtuous spirit of neighborhood solidarity, now measured through the richness of the social calendar, ranging from things like neighborhood watch groups, church choirs, and neighborhood bowling clubs. The mention of bowling clubs struck an irony in the context that bowling was actually what the 2 troubled high school students had chosen to do the night before they set out on a chilling shooting spree that killed 28 of their school classmates and injured 26 others in the Columbine High School massacre in Colorado. Later it turned out that the popular belief that they had gone out bowling the night before was actually based on mistaken memory, but still, this mistaken public memory is the one that remains etched in the minds of many who recollect this terrible incident that has been documented well in Michael Moore's acclaimed documentary on this subject. Moore thinks that the fact that these 2 troubled and extreme introvert kids who had difficulty fitting into their school communities had opted to enroll for bowling classes instead of other participatory sports that was mandatory part of school curriculum might say something about the growing problem of self-isolation among the American youth. He attributes this apparent lack of community engagement among the American youth to graver problems such as growing intolerance towards the homeless, the immigrants, the blacks, and other minorities. These ideals were completely set aside when Putnam's book on social capital was catapulted into the scene of international development, and neighborhood socializing was now presented as the solution to solve developmental problems in the Third World. Several NGOs launched grassroots and policy projects aiming at building or harnessing social capital through investments in American bowling-type neighborhood activities. And these may include periodic community training and get-togethers, temple and church societies, recreational ventures like picnics, etc., etc. This itself is not harmful, but presenting this as a new frontier of the global development certainly embarked a self-defeating kind of public amnesia on the historical roots of discrimination, including the injustices along the lines of class, caste, race, and nationalities, which need policy and popular intervention. The World Bank even launched an ambitious social capital initiative by CIII and brought on board Nobel Prize-winning economists Kenneth Arrow and Robert Solow to work on it. Later, the bank sought a quick exit after the concept came under attack from both economists and anthropologists. One staunch critic of the social development panacea, John Harris, had argued in his now famous book, Depoliticized Development, the World Bank and the Social Capital, that Putnam's oversimplified definition of the social capital conveniently singled out horizontal voluntary associations such as neighborhood clubs and choirs for policy interventions, while keeping the dark side of the social capital, such as criminal mafia, even political unions, and communal organisms at bay. He was quite right in pointing out that Putnam's book would have been just another book on the shelf with another idea to contemplate on, was it not for the unfortunate situation that the mega development agencies had picked it up as a new formula for development, one that would exonerate them from all development failures of the past. Those who had attacked Vietnam's good rather sharply were motivated to launch a harsh criticism for fear that ideas and practices may be counterproductively misattributed and misinterpreted if a course correction is not sought early on. Those who followed the formalism and substantivism debate still had not fully recovered from the earlier embeddedness fetish of the 1980s, revolving around Mark Granovetter's dichotomy of over and under-socialized embeddedness. Granovetter's main argument was that some sociologists out there had been embellishing the significance of the social context of economic and developmental transactions. His writing took a dismissive tone about the contemporary sociological discourse on industrialism, which took a view that profit motive itself is a societal phenomenon and takes a divergent trajectories and divergent unfolding in diverse societies. Hence, profit cannot be studied monolithically. Jens Beckert, who wrote a scathing criticism of Granovetter's misappropriation of Karl Polanyi in theorizing embeddedness as a business value concept. He gave examples that recreational industrial ventures such as whale watching as opposed to whale poaching, for example, and extending it to Nepal, perhaps trekking as opposed to hunting, have become a profitable industrial activity today only after enduring social movements on environmentalism and pacifism, which were anti-profit in nature. So yes, Beckert was also right on mark when he pointed out that Karl Polanyi, a Hungarian economic historian and a political economist, who wrote the acclaimed book, The Great Transformation, in 1944, just before the Second World War was over, had never quite used the term embeddedness as has been so prominently misattributed by Granovetter. Instead, he did talk about the process of disembedding of economy from society. And I'd like to flag that Polanyi's notion of disembedding was a holistic one, which took into consideration the entire ecosystem of our being, where each life, each profit, each loss, and each revolution is posited. And this is where I intended to bring back Miyazaki's Princess Mononoke in discussing a holistic ecology of death that entwined workshop with worship and humans with the broader landscape and lifescape that they are part of. While Miyazaki documented the death of Lady Iboshi's industrial hamlet, Polanyi was theorizing a new life, a vampire-ish one, if I may say so without sounding too cynical, launched by the massive success, and using the word success in a somewhat cynical term as well, of the British industrial revolution of the 18th and 19th century, which remapped the world through its colonial mercantilism. But in my opinion, one completes the other, I'm talking about Miyazaki and Polanyi, in seeking our answers about the ironies of industrial lives and deaths in the third world, especially Nepal. Polanyi's book documents British transition into the Industrial Revolution, what happened before and after the Industrial Revolution in and around Lancashire and Liverpool, where the wool and textile industry took off, enormously drawing on workers from the rural districts, especially after the notion of private property flushed the downtrodden from the lands that they had inhabited for centuries. The phenomenal rise of these industries later had global implications through its crisscrossing with British colonization, which sought to create captive markets in the colonized countries for the British. A good example of this is the importation of British textiles in its South and Southeast Asian and African colonies, which were later registered by people like Gandhi through Khadi movement. It was clear from the very beginning that this massive rupture of industrial revolution was going to be pretty harsh on many people. And so they did try to put in place few social security and welfare systems, including the much talked about Spinhaman Act and a series of poor laws, which didn't work very well, which then led to this counterproductive situation where the proponents of the welfare system lost their policy relevance, thus leading to unleashing of an even harsher wave of individualistic profit pursuits at the cost of social welfare, thereby establishing a ground for self-defeating moral and counter logic where the poor will be blamed for their misfortunes, and the state washes its hands off from its duty to care for all of its citizens. Polanyi's theorization of pre-disembedded society, that is the society before industrial revolution, is rested in three key notions of human economic solidarity: householding, reciprocity, and redistribution. Let me start with householding. People may remember that the word economy's etymology originates from oikonomia, which meant householding, and attributed to Aristotle, Alexander the Great's tutor in and around 350 BC. The context of Alexander the Great is relevant here because of the juxtaposition between the Greek and Roman civilizations. In Greek governance system, which was based on nobility, autarkic stability of feudal households took precedence over concerns of economic efficiency, whereas the Roman democratic system of governance is said to put latter above the former. It is important to remember here that Greek households, or oikos, of those times that Aristotle was talking about were not the nuclear households where sons are preferred and pampered over slaves. Earlier, the hierarchy between slaves and sons were more fluid and were largely maintained through rigorous work ethics, essentially because households were meant feudal social political units. Here, managing the household budgets did not seek maximum utilization of resources, but the fairest provisioning of services for all its members. Where I am highlighting the caveat that the fair in feudalism means fair in terms of reinforcing the exploitative social hierarchies. Fast forward several centuries, and economic anthropologists consider Adam Smith's notion of political economy to be a reconfiguration of the Greek versus Roman debate about meritocracy versus democracy, where latter's victory over the former was a situation placed firmly in Britain as opposed to the rest of contemporary Europe, and spread to its colonies and most importantly to the United States as part of the colonial hegemony. Adam Smith's political economy argued that commodity pricing based on demand-supply equilibrium is morally superior and more democratic than state elite-imposed pricing. Economic anthropologists explained that Smith's claim about morality and democracy was correct in the local politics of that era, where sellers of most agricultural commodities were the feudal elites controlling pricing through their privileged access to the state, whereas most buyers of those commodities were the proletariat working on the textile mills who had been flushed out of their rural ancestral homes through newly institutionalized laws on private property rights, written in favor of the feudal elites. Its democratic merits lay in the math that those who had to buy agricultural commodities far outnumbered those who had excess supply of those commodities and then could sell. This was not the case before the private property rights had been written in Britain in the 17th and 18th century. And the Enclosure Act of 1773 particularly, which motivated the feudal lords to build walls around their estate and evict the people living on them as tenant farmers, servants, and slaves. This also certainly is not the case a couple of centuries after the Industrial Revolution ran its course. This is the reason why I highlighted that bit about economic anthropologists earlier, because mainstream economics doesn't dwell much on the historicity of Adam Smith's theory. Now, Polanyi's second concept, reciprocity. Human societies have long fulfilled their material necessities through a complex web of social relations. David Graeber points out pretty convincingly in his book that the first 5,000 years that economists much used and abused imagination, that money was invented to facilitate impersonal barter between two persons, has no archaeological or anthropological grounding. There have been no real instances of primitive societies engaging in impersonal rationalistic barter. These societies either forged kin and consanguine relationships to facilitate prestations of material objects, as Marxian sociologist Marcel Mauss documented painstakingly, or they waged ruthless and violent wars that sought to either eliminate or at least subjugate other civilizations and rob their resources. This generation's increasing confusion between barter and reciprocity only shows public amnesia about profit and rationality's embeddedness into social logic of prosperity. Third is probably the most important pillar in explaining society-economy overlap, redistribution, that the rulers always took tax attributes from its subjects or citizens to make provisions in times of crisis like earthquake, war, flood, but also provisioning for the care of the old, the young, the sick, and the disabled, who could not be expected to participate in the economy in the same terms as the rest of the city generally. If anything, Polanyi argues, and Graeber and others have taken it further, that money was created to facilitate redistribution by the state and not facilitate barter, as mainstream economics leads us to believe. And this leads me to discuss another segment of Polanyi's book. Polanyi recognized that earlier equations which had balanced economic powers as social and governmental had been structurally disrupted by Industrial Revolution. And he pointed to making of three of these new things that carried the rupture, and he called these fictitious commodities: land, labor, and money. Land. Earlier, the king of the church took custody of almost all land, but the residents' right of its uses, however low their social and economic status might be, were not questioned. Nor the rulers considered altering traditional uses of land under their custody until the Enclosure Act that I mentioned earlier came through as a precursor to Industrial Revolution, whereby the squires now owned this land and they drove out physically the tenants and other residents to stop growing crops and instead to farm sheep to supply wool to be sold as raw materials for the early phase of clothing industry in Britain, before cotton from colonies took over wool in-house. Second is labor. There was no free labor force until the time of the Industrial Revolution. Most people were tied to the land, and unless people were in missionary or military services, most people did not migrate further than a couple of kilometers from their traditional homes. Mass migration into the Lancashire and Liverpool factories later turned them into labor as we know of today, with no social agency and defined solely by wages they received and tasks that they carried out. Last, money. They had been brought for long, but it was pretty clear that the markets could do only limited transactions, and that also within the broader norms and schedules regulated by society and culture. Coins, though existed before, were mostly used to pay taxes or temple tributes or other intangibles, and not to facilitate this much publicized imagination about barter. In villages where people knew each other, and also among enemies who did not know each other, there really was no barter. There were other more generous or more violent ways of making one's ends meet. Polanyi's book documented very well that the success of the textile industry in Britain and the new, if vampirish, as I suggested earlier, life it unleashed on British society and then spread it to the rest of the world through colonial means, wreaked havoc in earlier ways of being for humans. Many early economists were trying to figure out what was going on and with this unprecedented industrial rupture and its social and political aftermath. Adam Smith, Ricardo, Jeremy Bentham, and others have analyzed it differently, but the School of Economic Anthropology has maintained that their optimism about the future was based on the piecemealness of their methodology. Richard Owen's explanation was probably a more holistic one, as Polanyi reminds his readers, and ironically that he's the one associated with socialism, which now has a global subscription. Polanyi reminds us that until about the time of the British Industrial Revolution, not everything had a price. Not everything could be bought with money. Only few things could be, and the rest, especially tribute from other people and their work loyalty to your projects, had to be secured through social and military relations. This is not to say that life was better pre-industrial revolution. There were natural calamities, there were epidemics and wars where people died miserably and en masse. But there was no such thing called poverty, a very, very individualized notion of who could live a prosperous life and who could not. Poverty did not emerge until about 17th century, when the early enclosure acts took effect and the downtrodden were flushed out of their villages physically and put up in poor houses, whose conditions had to be made artificially squalid under the elite fear that people would not choose to join the industrial labor force unless all of the livelihood options were snatched away from their reach. The idea of unemployed came about a century later, as it is documented very well in Henry Mayhew's illustrated book, London Labour and London Poor. What Polanyi argued will be inevitable under these circumstances was that these conditions of disembedding of economy from society and state cannot be sustained for too long, and the governing institutions will be forced to correct their policies in favor of re-embedding. This is what he called a double movement. Polanyi's double movement is not at all a Malthusian notion, because unlike Malthus, who leaves the onus for correction of the imbalance created by food's arithmetic rise and population's geometric rise to the nature and the evolutionary forces, Polanyi attributes both the forces of disembedding and re-embedding to the governing institutions and the policies that they construct or end, such as the complex weight of enclosure acts and the institutionalization of the private property rights in the 17th century, labor and poor laws of the 17th and 18th centuries, and succeeding labor movements, as well as the civil rights movement and the state's ensuring of social welfare in the following centuries. These policies were pretty specific ones, but their contextualization was deliberately about much broader industrial ecosystem. This is what I wish to discuss in this notion of afterlife, which I've referred to in my book as the industrial ecosystem, and this notion will have to be about the broader nation and society, if not about multiple global waves of marketism and counter-marketism, and not only about garment industry in Kashmir Valley.
Thank you, Mallika. That was a rather grand sweep of searching out history from the Greeks all the way down to the present. I guess I had to ask you to limit your lecture to a certain time, hence you could not actually delve into the garment industry part at all. But for those of you who would have any questions related to the lecture today, or I guess regarding the book as well, some of you may have read, please feel free to venture your questions or any comments thereof. Yeah, let's start with the chair.
Hi, Mallika.
Yes, can you speak into the mic so that people can back in?
Okay, so I'll just start. Firstly, thank you for taking us out of methodology and for starting with rupture. My question, I look forward to reading the book, so my question might be redundant in that sense. Maybe all my answers are in the book. But my question is, you started off by talking about how you wanted to go beyond the traditional ways of looking at an industry. And you want to move beyond the typical frame of reference of money, people, etc. My question is, so what did you gain out of moving beyond that? What were you trying to do in that sense? And then what did you find were the costs of the death of the industry? So in the broader sense, in your ecosystem sense. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this question about this embeddedness or the holisticness is not only a macro picture, and I think it is possibly relevant at the very micro level as well. I could give examples of a very, very practical example of, I said, okay, I want to study clothing industry. At that point, in 2001, I didn't know much about the clothing industry. Essentially, certainly not much about the MFA politics or the trade wars. All of this, I was completely, unaware of all of this. I thought clothing because everybody has to wear clothes, and why not clothes? I looked at the figures, and it was at some point in the early 90s and late 80s. It was contributing to 1/4 of the total exports from Nepal. I thought this is the largest industry, this is the biggest employer, so we should be anthropologically relevant. And the point that I was trying to make was that there are so many set methods that are given to anybody who sets out to say, I want to study industries. I mean, almost every time the conversations lead to, so what should Nepal do? What kind of industry should Nepal have? Why didn't this particular industry work? And whose fault is it? This question keeps coming back every time, right? Is it the workers? Is it the businessmen? Is it the state? Is it the corruption? Is it the bureaucracy? Is it the civil war? And all of these things, right? And beyond that, I think so. The questions are already charted out. When you come to the field, I mean, I'm sure all those of you who do research first you do this kind of degree. And then you come to the field, and suddenly the gap between what you studied in books and what are you confronted in the field, the gap really kind of is pretty wide. But in the meantime, I think the methodology is given are pretty set as well. So initially, it looked like, there's data, so everybody should start with data, the number of figures. And if you want to go into the depth, then I was told that there's this ISIC kind of digits. It starts with 6 digits, 2 digits. It could go all the way up to the 6 digits. And if you really wanted to have a very in-depth analysis, one could be looking at those digits, and there's no shortage of that at all, right? And I actually spent a lot of time looking into those figures, except when I came to the actual shop floors and realized that the whole idea of digits is actually pretty irrelevant, because biggest dichotomy, the two different kinds of sub-businesses within the garment industry, for example, is later, I have the confidence to say mass and niche, and I've stayed with this dichotomy pretty consistently. But earlier I was not that consistent, and I thought there might be different variations, but the variations really involved around the different ways of life. People who approach defense for very different reasons, and people who saw the MFA, the policy opportunity, and thought until 2004 there's this privilege, the trade benefit given by the US, so there's this opportunity in terms of the policy, as opposed to the substance of the garment making. Yeah? And then there's other kinds who have always been making clothes. That's what their entire life dwelt upon. And they were in, the garment was, the word garment was not used at all. They probably used the word clothing. But they had been in this business for about a number of generations, So for them, although the ISIC digit at the level of 6-digit level is the same, it cannot differentiate between these two motives. It was pretty clear that when you go to the ground, these are completely different types of people. Yeah. And so their ecosystems, and here I'm not talking about broader, unified ecosystem, but their friend circle, their way of looking at opportunities and crises, their ability to handle certain difficulties and their ability to kind of capitalize on certain opportunities, they were just consistently very, very different, and one had to somehow address that. And that could only be done by defining what kind of people they are. And that would mean by ethnicity, by class, by profession, by just nature. After I kind of made the differentiation between Parirozani and Parirozani. And Parirozani kind of, that lived in this world of business running for a long time, and the skills that they have generated might have been ancestral, or other times they just are quick learners, they just have this great savvy, they learn from life. And then others who came with an MBA, maybe a commerce degree, and knew how to do the accounting, knew how to handle money, how to take loans. And so these two small mesocosms are actually quite different. And I was really looking for a methodology to handle these very micro issues. That's the starting point. And towards the end, when I began to talk about why did the garment industry die, why did it survive like in Bangladesh, this is a question I have been asked like so many times, and I really don't have an answer to that. But I think that question actually requires talking about a lot more than what happened on the shop floor, what happened in the Ministry of Trade and Commerce, and what happened in the Ministry of Finance, what happened in the trade union offices. It certainly has to be talked about a lot more. So at some point, my book began to be more about the Maoist movement rather than about the garment industry, about the nation state itself. And especially when I had the confidence to use the word death to mark a certain end of an era, not that there are no garment factories at all, not that people have stopped making clothes in Nepal, that's not what I mean by that clearly, but end of an era. And that era cannot be an era of garment, it has to be an era of civilization that is Nepal. And here I'm a bit reluctant to use the word Nepal because of the methodological nationalism concerns. But I think the Nepal as an entity, as a civilization, exists because it functions under a certain political and policy arena. And to be able to talk about that, I think that has to be not about garment industry, it has to be about a certain way of life, a certain era in Nepal's history. That's what I had in mind. And I think I would say again that there's very little, especially in Nepal's studies, there's very little that I could draw on to say, oh, I extend this methodology. And I was fascinated by Mashton Regni's archives and the tradition that he very well documented of the earlier modernism period under the Rana regime, the Naya Muluk, but that ended, after that, I think there's really very little in terms of methodology. That's what I was talking about.
You have a question? Mallika, you have a question?
Hello, Dr. Shakya. I just have one question that I would like to ask. In your essay, you talked about harnessing grassroots developments in South Asia and its relationship with self-defeating public amnesia. I would just like to, perhaps you could go deeper into talking about such developments and perhaps a bit more about what do you mean by public amnesia. Thank you.
I was side talking. It's really like something I shouldn't do. No, what do we mean by public amnesia?
No, before that, you talked about harnessing grassroots developments in countries that are located in South Asia. In specific context, I think you were talking about social capital, and I couldn't understand its relationship with self-defeating public amnesia. I mean, I understand Indonesia, but in what context I would like to perhaps know. Thank you so much.
We can take two.
Thank you very much for this, Mallika. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask maybe also about one of the civilizational concepts that are very much present in your book list, and that you also brought, which is the question of development. Because I think one of the things you do really beautifully is to somehow distance your analysis from the idea of economic growth as automatically leading to kind of civilization development of society, and you're using Polanyi partly to make the point, right? That development does not automatically, that growth does not automatically lead to a society that is good for the reproduction of livelihoods. But it seems that you're also opening up the question of development, and of course you have a foot in many camps because you have worked with the World Bank and so on. So I'm just wondering, is there a way, would you also distance yourself from the notion of development here and say that we actually have to find new concepts of thinking about what it means for an economy to actually help produce a nation in a way in which is respectable? So is development also a concept that we actually have to think critically about and open up? And what would then be possible to think about?
I think these two questions have a lot in common, so it probably would be okay if I try to answer the two. In terms of the social capital that I was talking about and amnesia, these are connected in a sense. So as taking from Diksha's question, what was I trying to do by bringing this notion of holisticness? What did it actually mean tangibly in terms of writing a book, in terms of shaping of your thought? So I was kind of the search for what framework could I use to explain the problem that I have in hand. That was quite a long journey, and I think that's kind of common for most researchers. And so this discourse about social capital and later embeddedness. So Bourdieu, Polanyi, Putnam, and Granovetter, all these people are the texts that I read in trying to look for an answer. What is kind of interesting for me was, so I wanted to discuss, I could wasted a lot of time, wasted something really cynical, but following write-ups on human capital, social capital, trust, business networking, all of these things, because it looked like at some stage that's what I was dealing with. And why? I mean, there was one point I was doing this kind of undisclosed survey this kind that every time you go and meet a garment factory owner, you have to do a lot of waiting because you are sitting in front of a table like this, and then he gets a call, and then it's important for him to take his call. Somebody comes and asks for signature, and then you are sitting there waiting for him to be done with this. And so what I began to do was began to look at all these visiting cards that most people have covered by a glass, the usual kind of relevant business cards, and so I'll quickly remember. My memory was sharp then. Now I'm old and I don't remember anything at all, and so this kind of approach has to end, right? But I was quickly kind of writing down, remembering what was this person's business alive. And later I also did a survey of business partnership. This is thing about in 2001 or so, everybody was talking about not new Nepal in the word new Nepal, but this whole notion about now we are democratic, now we are modern, all the old conservative notions about caste and these things don't matter, religion, and business people, we are so forward-looking. There's this narrative. And then in the meantime, we look at the business partnership, and I think I found, two people in entire valley that I met who ran garden factories way. There was a business partnership between people who followed two religions. And in almost all cases, the business partnership was always between people who came from the same ethnic background or religions. So I began to probe people and their alliances of who they called for the service provision, raw materials. There's such a kind of ethnic mapping of that, right? And that needed to be explained. And I kind of worked with frameworks like trust and business networking, all of that, and I actually found a social capital quite useful tool, except when I realized that in development particularly, people actually don't read Bourdieu, people just read Putnam. And I remember being in a very interesting debate in Oxford between Dr. Basuta Banu and Professor Barbara Harris-White about capital and as an extension of that social capital. And this very kind of up-and-coming bright Professor Masuda Banu says, Bourdieu is important, class is important, but in development, way clearly development studies is not sociology or not anthropology, and your engagement is clearly of an outsider. And as a development worker, you are expected to be in a country for more than 5 years, and so you're never going to understand Nepal or Pakistan or Lebanon or all these countries as anthropologists do after their 30 years of field work. So you need some tangible, more kind of more easier kind of interpretation, and they were taking Putnam's kind of interpretation of social capital. He never actually cites Bourdieu, he cites Coleman, but again he doesn't really kind of explain the complexities in Coleman's work very much. He then simplifies to say that if all the neighbors hanged out together, they will solve all the problems. You don't need elected parliaments, you don't need unions, you don't need social movements, you don't need political movements, you don't need states, you just solve your problems. This is a very American, very individualistic interpretation of social capital, right? Something that Bourdieu was that's not what he was talking about at all. But for some reason, this is why I wanted to bring this notion of public amnesia, that if the people that I was talking to, the development workers, the policymakers, I spent a lot of time with them. I think for them, the Putnam's type of interpretation of what the problem is or what the solutions are was so, that's what kind of buzzed around. And that's when I began to look into the discourse of formalism versus substantivism and how, substantive concepts have been co-opted by the rational choice theorists, or in a formalist way. So you take Bourdieu and then you pick, cultural capital. Sounds pretty cool, and sounds pretty fair. And then if you can harness social capital just by paying some NGOs to run some neighborhood watch clubs, then why, invest in serious structural government facilities, right? So I was a bit wary of these discourses. So the whole social capital debate was one, and embeddedness, a decade before with Mark Bramletter was another, and later reading Original Polanyi and the way Bramletter attributes the concept of embeddedness to Polanyi, but actually takes away everything else, was kind of quite interesting. And the debate that followed later, led by Chris Hahn, Keith Hart, Jens Beckert, I've mentioned, about how it's important to correct our understanding of our reading of the classics. That's what kind of has informed my own work as well. So I do dwell on the long history of how the debates have formed. So when the debates happen, it's not only two intellectuals debating one against another. It says a lot about the immediate contemporary kind of, the political context, the intellectual, the politics of intellectuality, and I think it gives us a frame through which we can understand the neoliberalism of certain parts of the world and the world itself, right? So that's how kind of I read this. Now, Dan's kind of question of development and nation, in many ways I thought that I have kind of conveyed that I don't take development as development organizations do take as a given, because I think it's quite important to look to the origination of the idea. So the concept of new states and the post-colonial new states, and I have talked, I think, a little bit about the 1960s era of development. It probably has to do a lot with all these countries who are kind of being decolonized, not institutional terms, but in terms of structural terms. And so India, being independent in 1947 and no longer being ruled by pre-colonial rulers, but post-colonial rulers. And so they had to define it. India couldn't go back to the pre-colonial India and said, okay, now let's go back to the glory of Mughal era. That's not what it did. And so then if we are not going back to the Indian nation state, pre-colonial, then it had to be something else. And then this whole idea of building nation, development comes with that. And so Joni Perry has written a lot about Nehru's secular temples, and in some ways the way factories have been built in technical assistance with the Russians, for the Germans, you know. And so, and this whole notion about what does it mean to be an Indian who is no longer part of a colony, a free Indian citizen, was that the state would now take care of your kind of, you know, the roti, kapra, makan kind of thing. So it has nothing to do with the king, the God's gift of the king. It's nothing much to do with the glory of the past, but the very practical kind of, you know, living standards, way of living. And this is where I think development has to be brought in. But my concern is that maybe must be so much more in Nepal, which was never colonized, and so it can't kind of join the post-colonial discourse in the same way as post-colonial countries actually can. So this notion about, you know, development is about making of a nation. I think it's even more difficult to generate that discourse in Nepal, I think. And so now we switch from, you know, I remember the generation, my generation of people, I have so many friends called Vikas, and I think people have written about the Panchayat's idea of naming Vikas, and now we're talking about prosperity, Samriddhi. Maybe there will be more people named Samriddhi now, you know? So maybe there's some kind of engineering of development now. But I think we seem to be shifting from, you know, this one kind of modality to other, but never quite commenting on the nation state itself. And in that sense, and also, you know, public amnesia in the sense that we've forgotten what happened in the 40s and 50s around the world. Maybe we are not to blame because it didn't happen the same way here with us. And so then why should we remember what happened in India and what happened in, you know, other countries? So it's not only amnesia, but it's also a certain kind of, the sort of filtering of global discourses into Nepal when we define what development is. And I thought it needed to be pinpointed. I mean, I don't have answers to that, but I thought, you know, if we just take it for granted, it will never be discussed. At least it needs flagging. That was.
Straight.
Dr. Shakya, I wanted to ask you, so in the Japanese anime story you cited, so at the end, in place of the iron industry, a new vegetation emerged, right? So without reading a book, I'm asking you, in place of garment industry here, when the industry dies, what happens to the new vegetation? So what emerged in Nepal? Especially what happened to the workers who were working in the garment industry? What were they doing after that?
That's a really intriguing question. If another question to I'm happy to have Hiraji here, you know, who actually runs the garment factory, and the story necessarily is very, very complex, right? In 2004, when I ended my formal field work, and that was the time when every day a factory was shutting, I think, and it looked like there was, you know, the narrative was of the workers. I mean, what happens when a factory is shut is actually very, very dramatic, right? You know, people don't know because you cannot shut a factory in agreement with everybody. That's not how a factory is shut. It has to be done periodically, and so people would have a sense of, you know, things are not working, and there will be more tangible kind of interpretation to it. So that's going air. So in my book, I've written about this phenomenon of going air. So consignments had to go via land. But then if you're too late behind the deadline, then you have to catch up on time, otherwise you won't be paid by the buyers, right, and you'll be left in debt. So that it had to be flown, and the cost of the flying has to be borne by the producer, not the buyer, as per the LC system, right? So the things would begin to go air, and so that becomes this factory buzz about, again it's going air, again it's going air, this is the third time it's going air, so it's going to shut down. Eventually it will shut down, but nobody would know that it's going to shut down. And then I talked about this whole notion of dasha. People know that, you know, I mean, the factory that I worked in, there were so many deaths before the factory shut. First of all, the owner's brother died, and then the second partner's brother-in-law died rather unexpectedly. There was a small accident accident, the fire accident, where people got really badly injured. And then there was a really serious bus accident with the workers, so where several people died. And there were kind of astrologers brought into factory to see what is the dasha of the factory, is it going through a kind of cosmological cycle. And so all of these are kind of building up, and finally when the factory shuts, then everybody comes to work as normal, and then you see that there's a padlock in the factory and nothing else. The factory owner doesn't sit there to explain, to answer the questions. So that was the mood in which I left. And like I've communicated, I've also written in the preface of the book that for a long time I didn't think about completing my thesis. I actually didn't, and also writing the book I thought about it much later, because it was very depressing thing. And from that era, later, I met people in the US when I moved to the US. Suddenly all these former government friends are there, living quite happily. They have gone through these horrible struggles of arriving as a new immigrant, but then some of them have actually done pretty well. And then there are stories about, the Middle Eastern accidents, the violences, and in many times the former government workers are the people who are in the receiving end of this violence. So the topic of garment industry and labor is very closely connected with the story of migration, especially to Middle East, but also other places. And now, fast forward a decade or so, and a lot of the garment factory friend owners are living actually, I think they have reinvented their lives. A lot of people are investing in stocks and they're actually making a lot of money, or they're doing completely different businesses, tourism, and they have reinvented their lives. And I was talking about what has happened to these buildings, and the other day I went to DuPont, and friends who had lived in garment factory for a long time were talking about this nostalgia of what happened to so and so. So what happened to this building? It looks like 80% of the garment factory buildings are now private colleges. And I asked, is that because now the workers are so empowered that the sons are now college-going kids, and is that what it is? And everybody laughed, and no, that's not that rosy at all. So that is afterlife. But the point I'm trying to make is, and the Garment Association itself, went through this crisis of, first there were over 1,000 members, and membership had tangible benefits because you will get the visa, which is the MFA quota, if you're a member of the GAN. If you're not the member, then even if you produce, you don't get the quota, the privilege, right? So people become members. So the membership was pretty high. From that phase, they went through a phase where there were no members at all. And in fact, the president, all of these people who had this kind of executional positions did not have factories. But it has steady income because, when the garment factories, the industry was profitable, they had levied taxes on everybody whose visa processing requests they processed. And so GAN was rich, so they built this massive real estate that they have rented out to this bank. And this source of income, and they don't know what to do with that income. So they actually keep going on these trade fairs around the world, all the seasonal production. And now, I think, now they have merged with other kind of garment factories. This, Tamil way clothing are sewn in a much smaller scale. And these people were not quite welcome in the Garment Association in the heydays because they thought, you produce how many clothes? 200, we are here talking about, 60,000 pieces of garments. Why do you even need the membership? You're not using the MFA quota anyway. And now I hear that the Tamil clothing merchants or the clothing association have merged. They have been welcomed into the Garment Association. So I think life actually takes very different forms. And I have been invited into recreational activities now done by former garment factory owner friends. And in the meantime, I hear now that the new agreement has been signed with preferential treatment for Nepal in the US. There might be rejuvenation of the garment. Clearly, like I was saying, so the garment industry life or death is not only about shop floors. It has seeped into everything else, which is the point of this whole motion about ecosystem.
I think we have run out of comments and questions, but I think on that happy note of the preferential treatment being restored and a different kind of afterlife than the notion that you have presented here. I'd like to thank you all for being here this evening, and thank you, Mallika, for taking time off. And all you will publish the rather conceptual paper that you have read out in some form. Thank you once again. And,
Thank you.